This Agriculture Today begins on the grain markets, and once again, we've another USDA report of great interest coming up next week in the form of the monthly World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates. We'll have a look at what traders think those numbers will say and much more with Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. And this WASDE report is the next potential market trigger, it would seem, Dan. And several entities have weighed in on what they think the corn and soybean production numbers will look like.
Yes, we're seeing groups such as the Farm Futures magazine put out their survey ahead of the August report, and they're indicating that their membership, as they reported back and given them their expectations for what they see out in the field, they're looking at a number for corn, something like 13.6 billion bushels is what's quoted in the article that they put out. For soybeans, about 4.2. The corn number, of course, would be down from 15.15 or so in terms of what we had last year in 2016. So, a substantial drop, about 1.5 billion bushels. And again, we're seeing that number followed by FC Stone coming out with their number, again projecting just slightly lower corn production, 13.59 billion. Again, these numbers are kind of gravitating right now around 13.6. And U.S. yields for corn, again, from the Farm Futures Survey, 163.5, FC Stone, 162.8. Then you'll see those individual reporting entities followed up by the pre-report estimate out of the Bloomberg Ag Group, and their numbers that they're looking at for U.S. corn yield, on average about 165.9. Again, those numbers just slightly higher, 2 or 3 bushels higher than either the Farm Futures or the FC Stone survey numbers. So, again, interesting to look at. The projection from the aggregated group of about 30 market analysts going into the Bloomberg pre-report, pre-trade estimate would be for U.S. corn production to be about 13.8 billion. So, we're kind of hemming this thing in terms of the expectations. In general, you've got some folks thinking as low as about 13.5 is about the lowest end of what you see for projections. You still see some looking at 14, but either way, what we don't see is something with a 15 in front of it, or a 14.5, or even a 14.1 or 14.2. It looks like right now their expectations are running from about 13.5 to about 13.9 or just under 14, and we'll see where that takes us. Either way, that does lead to at least marginal, moderate tightening of U.S. corn reserves, ending stocks, heading off into next year. It's the pre-report number, on average about 1.94 billion bushels, and that would be down from the July report estimate that the USDA put out of about 2.3. So, again, you crunch all those numbers, you end up with something about 350 to 400 million less bushels quantity-wise for ending stocks. On the soybean side, whereas for corn we're looking at fair drops from last year, not near as much for soybeans. Again, we're just entering into August. So, again, the dry conditions that we're seeing, up in the northern plain states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and now actually coming down into, in a pretty significant manner, down into a fair swath of Iowa, about 2/3 of the state, almost everything except the northeast corner of it. So you've got some pretty important areas, particularly if Iowa's involved, that are somewhat droughty. Of course, Nebraska gets affected by that. Have our parts of Kansas affected by some of those drought monitor numbers. But again, when you're getting to the heart of the Corn Belt in a state such as Iowa, you're looking at some real issues. And Eric, as we look at the ag press, there are varying conditions of, great yields off in parts of Iowa, Illinois, but you'll also read in some parts of those regions that they have only moderate to somewhat disappointing yields, again, just depending on where the rains came. Mm-hmm. So how I would view the upcoming report is that it will be the first actual attempt at a hard set of numbers for U.S. crop production for corn, soybeans, and grain sorghum for this year. And how that number comes in, it doesn't spell the total story for the corn market, but it's an awfully important first step, and especially if there'd be some surprise away from these numbers that we've just been talking about, either something below 13.5 billion bushels of corn or something above 4.2 billion bushels of soybeans. Then you're looking at potential, I guess, paradigm change in these major commodity markets, and we just have to see where the market would go as it literally gropes to figure out what a market clearing equitable price is when you start changing its underlying assumptions on just what its supplies are.
Well, the picture becomes increasingly clearer as the subsequent reports come out from the USDA. This one, again, is due next Thursday, August the 10th, from the department. Some other market factors of interest here, though, Dan. Bullish export figures for corn, for wheat, and for soybeans this past reporting period.
Surprisingly, for corn, we need to have a pace of about 40.9 million bushels a week to meet the USDA's July 10th projection for this whole crop marketing year. We've got about 5 weeks left in it, and we came in at almost 43, so that's a bullish number. For grain sorghum, we've been struggling along on grain sorghum exports at numbers like 2, 3, 4 million bushels per week, and came in last week at 6.6. Again, I think probably the USDA will have to come in and lower their estimates of U.S. grain sorghum exports, and we'll probably see something closer to 200 million or 180 million bushels rather than the 220 that the USDA had. So we'll be looking for that in those supply-demand numbers that'll come out next Thursday. On the wheat side, U.S. hard red winter wheat exports had a really good, strong week for the week ending July 27th. Again, 11.1 million bushels. We need a pace of about 7.3 for the rest of this new crop marketing year that wheat is in for hard red. So, 11.1 during a week when we need an average of about 7.3, and that's all to the positive. And again, you've got different issues happening around the world, particularly, hard red spring production to the north of us, both in the Dakotas and across the border up into Canada, all suffering, and various issues around the world that are being struggled with, I guess, in terms of some of the wheat production areas. So that's all for the positive, I guess. And in terms of us, I would say that kind of the quiet, subtle factor that is not hurting our exports, and by any stretch, is that the U.S. dollar, again, following optimism for the U.S. economy and the U.S. Federal Reserve's actions in terms of how it's going to handle some of its financial strategies. The U.S. dollar as an index has fallen down to about 92.7, down from about 104 in terms of where it was at the beginning of this year. So the cheaper the U.S. dollar becomes relative to any of these other currencies around the world, then just all that much better of a situation for us in U.S. agriculture in terms of being able to push product out of our shores. If people have to exchange their currencies for the dollar, if they can buy it cheaper, well, they can buy more bushels on the other side.
And that really is the common denominator, considering that all three major grains, in fact, were posting improved export numbers.
Yes, U.S. soybean exports, again, singing out of the same hymnal, you might say, in terms of having a week of 26 million bushels of exports, needing 17 to meet the USDA's projections for this for the last 5 weeks of this marketing year in terms of a weekly pace. So really some very positive things happening. Of course, would not be surprised that some worries by foreign buyers about what type, size, what quality of crops we'll have here in the U.S. as we've got some weather uncertainty, no doubt, did not give any less impetus for those buyers to come and try to secure supplies just because they're a little bit more worried about their availability.
Well, Dan, one more market dynamic we might highlight this time around, and you bring this to our attention, that there's quite some discussion now about a glut of ethanol on the market and just how that might resonate for the feed grain sector. Yes,
one of the static positives, again, consistent supportive messages we've had in the feed grain markets has been that ethanol usage for U.S. corn and for grain sorghum also has been holding up very, very well. Now we see some reports coming out earlier this week that we've built up supplies and inventories to the place where some of our functioning ethanol plants are looking at shifting the ethanol product they put out the door off into other uses. Again, human alcohol consumption, even some industrial uses are being considered. So that's probably nothing to be overly panicky about yet, but it is a signal that there's something happening, in the combination of factors that affect the ethanol industry that is causing inventories to move higher and raises just a little bit more caution than we've been having for a good while now in terms of whether ethanol demand will hold up strongly. We really hope that ethanol production would hold up well in the U.S. just so we can keep moving product and work through these large stockpiles. If that would weaken to the degree that we'd have 1 or 2 or 300 million less bushels of corn used, well, then we find that corn very likely back at ending stocks and just makes it harder to get decent prices for sales.
Well, when we touch base again next Friday, we will have in hand the USDA's grain production and stocks report coming out again next Thursday, and we'll hash over those numbers at that time. Dan, thanks for your input once again.
Thanks. Take care, Eric.
He's along with us every week to talk grain market factors, is Research and Extension grain market economist for K-State, based in Northwest Kansas, Dan O'Brien. And we'll return shortly here on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and as we continue on now, we're going to introduce to you a crop insurance concept that has been tried in other parts of the nation in the last year or so, and it is now going to be available here in Kansas with the 2018 corn and soybean production years. It's called Margin Protection, and it'll be the topic of one of the breakout sessions at the Risk and Profit Conference that K-State Agricultural Economics will host in a couple of weeks from now. And the presenter will be our guest now, Monte Vandeveer. Monte is the Research and Extension Agricultural Economist for K-State, based in southwest Kansas. Monte, you've been tracking the progress of this new risk management tool. It has been tried out on a pilot basis elsewhere, correct?
Yes, Margin Protection, it was just announced, was going to be a new product available in Kansas and many other states for the 2018 crop year. Now, it's operated as a very limited pilot status, though, in several other states for the last 2 crop years. So Kansas is going to get the coverage for corn and soybeans for 2018.
And the idea behind this, the concept of margin protection and the ingredients that go into it.
Well, margin in this case means the difference between your crop revenue, your price times your yield, minus your out-of-pocket operating costs. So it's revenue minus your operating costs is the margin. Now, we've had revenue insurance for a long time, and most people get that today. Mm-hmm. So that protects us against declining yields or declining prices, or both. But margin protection adds the feature of protecting against rising input costs.
And that really is the new nugget that this is purported to cover, and that is the risk associated with those costs escalating on a producer.
Well, that's the intention, and that's the reason we're talking about it in late summer 2017, is the sign-up is in the end of September, but the idea is it protects against increasing input costs between now and planting time next spring.
And we will stress that sign-up period once again, for it's coming up sooner than producers might suspect. When we talk input costs, what costs are covered exactly under the umbrella of this coverage?
Well, it has a couple different categories of costs, you might say. First is the set of input costs that can rise between now and next spring. And those are things like urea fertilizer, that represents our nitrogen cost. Diammonium phosphate, that's our phosphate fertilizer cost. Protects against rising costs of diesel fuel. And it also includes protection for potash fertilizer for our potassium component. And it also has a feature that calculates interest costs. Mm-hmm. So all of those are included in our group of inputs that are protected.
There's an important point to this that you stress in your presentation, though, Monte, that these costs are determined on a county basis, that policy does not utilize one's own input information.
Right. It would be kind of difficult, to say the least, to have everyone turn in all their paperwork on their input costs. So what they do instead is they base it on what inputs would be required to produce a given county yield, and everything's going to be driven off the county yield. So what they do is they have some formulas that you plug in your expected county yield for the next year, and then your urea, potash, phosphate, fertilizer, all those numbers are determined by formulas. So that's how the input levels are set. It's all triggered off of county yields.
And seed, herbicides, machinery costs, they're also included there, correct?
Yeah, they're in another big lump of other costs, but those costs are not going to be measured. Again, I mean, you're not protected against those costs increasing between now and next spring. They're included in the cost calculation for the margin, but you're not protected against those costs rising.
The coverage features, we might speak to those, the options that producers can consider here as far as their guarantee. There's something else in there called the protection factor. Explain all that, if you would.
Right. Because this is going to be based on county yields, it's going to use this protection factor, this feature that's also found in our other area-based crop insurance products. Our area revenue and area yield insurance plans have this protection factor where you can scale your coverage up or down by another 20%. The intention there is if you think your yield or returns will differ significantly from the county, then you can scale it up or down in order to match. So that's the protection factor that is found in our other area-based products. I think the other really interesting thing about margin protection is you can pick some very small deductibles. You can get coverage up to 95% of your expected margin, which means it would take only a very small change in yield or price or your input costs in order to trigger a payment.
And you can couple this with your more traditional coverage on revenue protection, for instance, or yield protection. All of this can be complementary of each other.
Right. In margin protection language, your regular revenue insurance or your regular yield insurance is called the base coverage, and you can get credit for part of that premium because there's going to be some overlap between margin protection and your base underlying policy. But that's really going to depend on your location, whether you're irrigated or dry land, and they've got a website where we can look those numbers up, try to get an estimate of what it might cost.
Well, Monte, you've gone to the trouble of putting together several examples that illustrate how this margin protection coverage might work in various locations around Kansas. You'll be passing that along directly in detail at the Risk and Profit Conference. Another encouragement there for producers to be there to take that presentation in person. But how you see margin protection stacking up compared to other coverage plans and risk management tools that the crop producer might employ? There are pros and there are cons, you say.
Well, the pros, I think, on the margin protection side is if you're interested in getting a very low deductible, then margin protection will let you really choose a high level of coverage. And because it has this premium credit, you can get a little bit of relief, you might say, from your overall insurance costs. So the payouts are going to be a lot more frequent. You also get this feature of protecting against the rising input costs. If you're afraid your fertilizer or diesel costs, for example, are going to go up between now and then.
But there are some things to consider as well, including the expense of this coverage.
Yeah, because the coverage level is so much higher and the payouts are more frequent, the premium is going to cost just that much more too. A couple other things that I think people would be thinking about here is, again, you have a program that's based on county yields. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that you think your yield experience might differ from the county, that's a little bit of slippage potentially in there. And it's also because the county yields aren't announced until some months later, you have to wait a couple more months maybe before you see any indemnity check come along.
So all of that considered, it is another tool in the risk management toolbox, and the closing date is the end of September, you say?
Right. The price discovery periods where the initial prices are set, that runs from middle of August to middle of September, and then producers will have a couple more weeks till the end of September to decide if they're going to get that coverage or not.
Once again, it's margin protection insurance coverage for crop production, and it's being expanded for 2018 cropping throughout most of Kansas. So producers be aware of that. And Monte, lastly, you will be sharing all of this in much more detail at the Risk and Profit Conference at K-State coming up again in a couple of weeks, correct?
Right. We'll have a couple of breakout sessions. We'll do that 2 different times, so if people are interested, hopefully they can find a time. And also, we'll try to have a write-up put out there on Ag Manager website, and so if you can't make it to the conference or just want to read over it again, we'll have that information out there too.
Excellent. And incidentally, the Risk and Profit Conference is set for Thursday and Friday, August the 17th and 18th here on the K-State campus. agmanager.info has all of those particulars if you'd like to check into that. Monte, thanks for going over this. We'll see where it goes from here, this margin protection plan as an addition to the suite of crop insurance options for producers. Appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Eric.
He is Monte Vandeveer, agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension. He works out of southwest Kansas. You're tuned to Agriculture Today, and more is coming your way after this break over the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Moving on now to today's agricultural news headlines for you. These courtesy in part of DTN. Farm incomes and commodity prices may be falling for a 3rd straight year. However, farmland is generally holding its value and increasing it in some cases. That's according to a new USDA report just out. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
With farm incomes and commodity prices still falling, you would expect to see farmland values falling as well, but a new USDA report says actually
land prices have held in there.
USDA Outlook Board Chairman Seth Meyer. Now, these numbers we're giving are national. The report says U.S. cropland is averaging this year the same as last year's $4,090 an acre, and farm real estate values
up a little over 2% for all land. But that's also, land and buildings. That's all farmland for all purposes.
That's up $70 an acre from last year. Seems landowners are holding on to their farmland, not much sales action.
If folks think that this downturn is just a temporary softness, then you don't want to put your land out there unless you absolutely have to, because you say, well, it'll come back.
And so overall, cropland values are holding steady, except in the drought-stricken northern plains, where they're down by almost 4.5%, but they are up 6% in the southern plains. But for cash rents, USDA reports those heading down, a little bit down.
I think when you look at the cash rent data, you can see more of that short-run movement. You talk about cropland rents being down at the U.S. about 5.5%. And you look through the states, and that's pretty consistent. Sometimes you think geographically things are different. But Iowa's down about 6%, California's down about 6%. And you don't see those same changes in the underlying ag land value changes.
Not yet, anyway. And Meyer says, meanwhile, for rental rates, he expects to see more declines as this year wears on and it comes time to renegotiate those rental contracts. In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Now, as for the Kansas numbers out of that report, the farm real estate value here in the state decreased from 2016, according to the USDA. Farm real estate value for 2017 averaging $1,850 per acre. That's down $30 per acre, or 2% from last year. Breaking that down even further, cropland value decreasing 4% from last year to $1,970 per acre. Dryland cropland value averaging $1,870 per. That's $70 lower than last year. Irrigated cropland value averaging $2,850 per acre. That's $150 below a year ago. And pasture land at $1,280 per acre, $10 lower than the previous year. As for cash rents paid to landlords in 2017 for cropland, mixed compared to last year. Irrigated cropland rent averaging $128 per acre. That's $1 below last year. Dryland cropland rent at $56 per, unchanged from a year earlier. And pasture rented for cash averaging $19 per acre, unchanged from the previous year. County-level averages of 17 cash rents paid to landlords, by the way, will be released by the USDA on September the 8th. And the USDA reports that farm and ranch production expenditures in Kansas totaled $17.7 billion in 2016, down 13% from a year earlier. Livestock expenses, the largest expenditure category, at $6 billion, decreased 23% from 2015. Feed, the next largest expense category, at $2.5 billion, decreasing 23% from 15. And rent, the third largest total expense category, at $1.54 billion. That increased 5% from 2015. Livestock expenses accounting for 34% of Kansas' total production expenditures, feed accounting for 14%, rent at 9%, and farm services at 8%. These results based on data from Kansas farmers and ranchers who participated in the Agricultural Resource Management Study conducted by the USDA. Producers were contacted January through April to collect 2016 farm and ranch expenses. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of the Kansas Wheat Scoop coming your way. Here's Marsha Boswell.
On average, wheat streak mosaic virus causes $75 million in losses to Kansas wheat farmers every year, but this year's losses were much higher. If we take preventative measures now, future yields will improve exponentially. The virus is spread by the wheat curl mite, which feeds on wheat and other grasses. The best way to prevent the spread of wheat streak mosaic virus is to remove volunteer wheat and other grassy weeds. Volunteer wheat can be killed with herbicides or tillage and must be completely dead and dry for 2 weeks before planting a new crop. A second management practice to limit the spread of the virus is to avoid early planting. Plant wheat after the Hessian fly-free date for your area. Planting after these dates will reduce the risk for the new wheat crop and prevent wheat curl mites from moving to new locations of wheat. In addition, there are a few wheat varieties with moderate resistance to this devastating disease. Hard white wheats Joe and Clara CL, as well as hard red winter wheat Oakley CL, have performed well in areas with wheat streak mosaic. Kansas Wheat Commissioner Jason Oakes, who farms in Hamilton County, said his area was hit particularly hard this year with wheat streak mosaic. However, Oakes plants exclusively hard white wheat, and his fields were mostly spared. By planting these resistant varieties and making the choice to plant later, we weren't hit as hard by wheat streak mosaic virus as many of my neighbors were. He said it's absolutely essential to control volunteer wheat. Because of the weather conditions, there's likely to be more volunteer this fall than last year. Even though money is tight in wheat right now, we are limiting future profits if we don't get rid of it for 2 full weeks before planting. Our choices are to spend a little bit of money this fall or lose a lot of money next harvest. The resistance to wheat streak mosaic is less effective at temperatures above 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Therefore, planting these varieties early for grazing can place fields at risk for disease-related yield losses. Researchers at Kansas State University are developing a trait, WSM3, that is highly resistant to both wheat streak mosaic and triticum mosaic viruses. Bernd Freeby, a research professor with the Wheat Genetics Resources Center, said the WSM3 gene is just the third gene known to provide resistance to the virus, and the first that can do so at outdoor temperatures of 75 degrees and higher. Through traditional breeding processes, it can take several years before resistance genes show up in varieties available for planting. A new variety with the WSM3 gene should be released for foundation seed in about 3 years, making it available to farmers the following year. For more information, visit kswheat.com/stopthestreak. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marsha Boswell.
Many thanks, Marsha. Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather is in next. This is Agriculture Today.
Man, it's hot out here. Heat stress affects more than just humans. It also affects livestock. Extreme heat, humidity, wind speeds, and cloud cover all make a difference in air temperature. To control problems, make sure your livestock have shade and water provided at all times. This will help prevent problems in breeding, meat production, and reduce chances of death. Please take all these into consideration for livestock production. Brought to you by K-State Animal Science Leadership Academy participants.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, our weekly stint on Kansas agricultural weather. And across the way once more is research and extension climatologist at K-State, Mary Knapp. And we'll talk about this cool down in Kansas in just a moment, but first to recap the month of July. Most folks presumed that it was a warmer than usual July, Mary.
It was warmer than normal by about 1.5 degrees, which isn't particularly astonishingly warm. What is interesting is that we did not set any record highs in the month of July. And when you top off at 111, which was our warmest reading at the Salina Airport, that gets to be a little bit interesting. You go, wait a minute.
What is the record?
Well, the record is 121 degrees, 2 different occasions in 1934. But it brings into mind that this was July, and it is a warm time of the year. And it is also worth noting that that warm spell, which was in the middle of the month, was sandwiched between very cool start to the month and a very cool end to the month. And we saw a couple of days where we had record low high temperatures and a couple of days where we had record warm low temperatures. Mm-hmm. So, again, that's part and parcel with what we would usually see in the month of July. What is less enjoyable about the month was that it was drier than normal for most of the state. The only area that actually was on the wet side was the Southwest. They saw several major systems go through that brought quite a bit of moisture there. And it may surprise people that the Northeastern Division was not wetter than normal, despite the end of the month with copious amounts of rain in Johnson County with flooding that was part of that, but that wasn't enough to pull the rest of the division up above the threshold, and so we ended the month, again, drier than normal for most of the state. Southwest was the one area that didn't fall below the line. When we look at the year-to-date, we are still fairly well ahead, which is why we're not seeing more on the U.S. Drought Monitor. We did see an expansion of some of the abnormally dry conditions and a slight expansion for the moderate drought. But again, given the fact that we had such a wet spring, that's not falling below the line very quickly.
And to remind, the moderate drought in Kansas, is that largely in the Northwest? Where?
Well, the moderate drought is largely in the north central and central parts of the state. Ottawa County would be an area that you might look at for the very dry conditions that they've had there. They've missed out on most of the rains, and so that has carved them a little bit deeper in the hole. And an example of that would be, you would see in Manhattan we may have had a half an inch of rain. In Minneapolis they may have had 5/100ths. So that's where the problems have started to develop.
But that may well change, and we'll get into that shortly here. But how about these fall-like cool temperatures as we eased out of July into August? Extremely unusual, isn't it, for this time of the year?
It is unusual. We haven't seen yet whether we've set any records as far as that cool start, but it is an unusual beginning to August. And that is likely to continue for the next 8 to 14 days. We're calling for cooler than normal conditions. It should be noted that not everybody has seen quite as cool. They've been cooler than normal or near normal, but South Central and the western part of southeastern Kansas have been a little bit more on the warm side. An example, again, yesterday Manhattan topped off at 80 degrees, but down in the South Central it was up in the 90s to 92, 93. So again, depending upon where the cloud cover was and where actually the boundary between the north winds and the south winds set up, that is where we saw the difference in the temperatures. This weekend, that cold front and warm front are going to battle out a little bit more. That's going to bring rain across much of the state. We've got a very good chance of significant moisture. And in fact, if we look at the quantitative precip forecast, which looks at how much moisture should be wrung out from the system, we're looking at as much as 5 inches from the Flint Hills eastward. And even up in the northwest, they're looking at 1 inch to maybe 2 inches of moisture in the 7 days ending next Friday.
But just about everybody in Kansas has a shot at rain this weekend?
At this, it looks like there's a fairly good chance that everybody will have a shot at getting at least measurable precipitation, and we may get some fairly significant rains out of this.
And the cooler temperatures will hang around for a couple of weeks, and there are still further chances for rainfall as we push deeper into August then?
Well, again, we look at that 8 to 14 day, the chances get a little bit more moderated. Wetter than normal is strongest in the southern third of the state, but it is pretty much statewide for that wetter pattern. And they've updated the August outlook that was issued on the 31st of July, and that updated outlook calls for wetter than normal conditions in the southwest. That's not a big stretch since they've seen enough moisture in the first 4 days of August to really be above their threshold for the rest of the month. Not the distribution pattern that we would like, but that is the picture. It is also a good chance for cooler than normal conditions statewide.
And that's a big change from the previous forecast.
This is a big change. The previous forecast was calling for warmer than normal. But when you front load the month with much cooler than normal conditions, and we're talking right now areas that are running 7 to 8 degrees cooler than normal for the first 4 days, that gives you a thumb on the scale to keep it cooler than normal or normal to finish out the month.
Well, in any event, moisture in the soil profile will be a nice setup for fall wheat planting and other fall-planted crops likewise.
Right, and it will be very welcome for those that have the soybeans in the ground. The soybean crop was beginning to show quite a bit of stress with the warm, dry conditions, and this will be a shot in the arm. Probably not going to make a whole lot of change to the corn crop. A lot of that was already into the grain fill stage, and it won't benefit as much from that moisture. But sorghum and soybeans, this will be a very nice shot in the arm to that.
All right. We appreciate the word. Thanks for coming over, Mary.
Thanks, Eric.
And she's along every week to talk Kansas agricultural weather with us. Research and Extension, climatologist at K-State, Mary Knapp. Likewise, our thanks to you for being along with us, and enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.